good. All right. So, just put that down on my seat. You can move that over a little bit so they have room. Okay, we're ready to begin. I understand you're well rested. It's a very good night's sleep. So if I was going to put you to sleep, then possibly waking up at 4:30 in the morning may. My topic this morning is the birth of the Austrian School. And by the way, good morning to everyone. And what's interesting is that this is one of the few times in intellectual history in which we can identify the exact time and person that founded a school of thought. And that person I'll be talking about is Carl Menger. The Austrian school, it's often, there's a confusion that arises when people talk about the Austrian school because it's considered to have been founded during the Marginalist Revolution, which it was, and to be one of the three schools of thought that was simultaneously and independently founded on the basis of the law of marginal utility. But that understates how different the Austrian school is from the other two schools of thought that were based on the law of marginal utility. And the law, and we'll talk about this, the Marginalist Revolution was really the idea that satisfaction, consumer satisfaction from the consumption of a good plays a role in determining its price and its value. It's not just cost of production. So all three marginal revolutionaries, we may call them, Carl Menger from Austria, William Stanley Jevons from Great Britain, and Leon Walras, in the early 1870s, their books came out, and all three of them came up with some version of the law of marginal utility. But that's only a small part of Austrian economics, as we'll see. Let's take a look at the terms that were used. The Austrians used the term marginal utility. Menger did not coin that term, his student did. And again, utility is just satisfaction or the subjective value someone gets from consuming a good. Jevons used the term final utility, and Walras used the French term rarité. Now, all of these three terms did refer to satisfaction, but there was a bit of a difference. But before let's take a look at these people. I love to do this. Notice this is William Stanley Jevons, dashing ladies' man when he's young, but like a weird old guy who's feeding pigeons in a park when he gets older. Leon Walras, kind of mysterious and dark when he's young, but he's like your grandfather as he gets older. But Menger is hip and handsome when he's young and becomes very distinguished when he's older. And that's sort of carried over to the modern Austrian school. I like that. So what were the differences between them? Very briefly. One, Jevons and Walras, the non-Austrians, considered cost and satisfaction or utility to be co-determinants and to mutually determine prices, okay? And secondly, they believed that utility or satisfaction was quantifiable, could be added up, you could subtract it, and you could compare it between different people, that there was interpersonal comparisons. Menger would have none of that, okay? For Menger, utility was simply a result of an individual's judgment about the importance of concrete goods in satisfying their wants, okay, and improving their well-being. So Menger was a lot different. He didn't see utility as something that was quantifiable or tangible in some sense. Well, what he saw it as was a ranking of things that were more or less important in to determining your welfare. So here, for example, you would rank, for Menger, you didn't add up utility, you ranked utilities. you ranked the satisfactions that you got from different goods. So if you had $2 and you were standing in front of a vending machine, for example, if you would use that $2, assuming all of those alternatives that I have listed are $2, absorb the $2, you would purchase the bottle of water because it is more important in your own judgment, your own subjective judgment, than the other two alternatives. And there are many more things you could do with that $2. So you're always trying to find the greatest utility in allocating your resources. So that was Menger's point, very important. But he discovered much more than the principle of marginal utility, okay? His whole economics was based on subjective value and individual choice. He believed that it was really, value was determined solely by subjective value, by utility. And costs really had nothing to do with it. In fact, costs themselves were determined by consumers' choices and values. So he was a creative genius, and he had a lot of influences. He didn't just come out of, his system didn't come out of the blue. It was developed from some German economists, some French economists, some early Italian economists, but he was the one who put it together and showed that really economics, as we'll see, was the explanation of what the striving for human welfare entailed, okay? The wants that were satisfied, okay? That was at the base of his system. Now, let me just give you one quote. Menger was touted by everyone as the founder of the Austrian School. But let me give you Mises' quote on this. Mises said, "What is known as the Austrian School of Economics started in 1871 when Carl Menger published a slender volume under the title Principles of Economics. Until the end of the 70s, there was no Austrian School. There was only Carl Menger." And let me just say something about the term Austrian School. That was a term of derision, okay? That was a term that mocked the Austrian School as a backwater intellectual movement. And it was coined by the German economists who were historicists and were opposed to theory, okay? That is the theory that the Austrians claimed was universal and in time and in space, explained all the implications of all human action, no matter when or where they took place. And Schumpeter and Hayek also praised Menger as the founder of the Austrian School and as the creator or the creative genius that brought us a structure of economics that was completely integrated. So when Menger was starting out, the dominant school of thought was the classical school, and I just want to briefly mention some of their main doctrines. But these are the men who formed the classical school or who created the classical school: David Hume, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. And so for about 100 years, they really dominated economics. So did Menger want to overthrow them? No, he didn't want to overthrow them. He wanted to give them some of their principles a foundation in human choice and value. So what did the classical school tell us? Well, they had the great insight that prices are not random. They're not determined by tradition. They're not arbitrary. Business doesn't just simply set prices and tell consumers that's what you have to pay if you want this good. They believed and taught that the prices were determined by a universal law, and that's the law of supply and demand. And they knew that these prices were used by businessmen to calculate profits, losses, revenues, and costs, which permitted them then to allocate resources to the most efficient uses from the point of view of consumers. So if there were profits, businesses knew that consumers urgently demanded these goods, more urgently than other goods, and would move resources into those areas where there were high profits. So that was a calculation. It was based on their calculations using actual market prices. The classical school did understand this, and this is an important part of Austrian economics too. Where there were losses, it meant that these goods were using up resources that were more valuably used elsewhere, okay? Had a greater value elsewhere. And in the long run, that there was a tendency for profits and losses to disappear as entrepreneurs moved from those areas where there were losses and a lack of demand to those areas where demand was more urgent and there were profits. But there was a flaw in this great system of economics that the classical school built up, and it was this. They attempted to explain prices and exchange by referring to broad and abstract classes of goods. For example, bread, diamonds, milk, coal, iron, cotton, beef, okay? So that caused a dilemma, or that caused a paradox for them. Human beings don't think of entire abstract classes of goods, that bread is more important to me than diamonds, or diamonds are more important to me than bread. That's not the way they think. They think in terms of units of the good. There are concrete units of a good, and there are concrete wants for a good. We all have concrete wants for air, okay? But there's so much air, but the concrete units of air in this room, for example, the cubic feet of air that are in this room, is so great that it's superabundant. It more than exceeds our wants and needs for air. So for the Austrians, as we'll see in a moment, air has no value, okay? A cubic foot of air, okay? You can't say all air has no value. We don't think in those terms. But if we were to lose a cubic foot of air from this room, nobody's wants would be impaired. No one would have to reduce their well-being because there's less air in the room. So air, as essential as it is to sustaining human life for more than a few minutes, is a good that has no value from the Austrian point of view, which we'll talk about. So anyway, this confusion, this fundamental flaw in classical economics caused the classical school to get bogged down in what's called the paradox of value, and greatly affected the way that they explained how prices were determined. So what is the paradox of value? What's sometimes called the water-diamond paradox. Diamonds have a very, very high exchange value. That is, they have a high price on the market. That's their exchange value. But they have a very low use value in everyday life, okay? They're used for ostentation, ornamentation, to show how rich, conspicuous consumption. You wear them around and flash them to show how rich you are and so on, okay? So in some sense, they satisfy what some people may say are trivial human wants. But water, on the other hand, has a very low exchange value on the market, but yet it has a very high use value, okay? It's very useful to human beings. If you can't go without water for more than 3 days without dying of thirst. And therefore, it does serve very, very important wants. Some of the wants are more important than wants for diamonds. So how did the classical school deal with this paradox? Okay, so this is just an illustration of the water-diamond paradox. Notice that diamond, which was the fancy pink, fancy intense pink diamond, was sold at auction back in 2010 for $46 million. No one knows how much. Does anyone know how much that cost? No one knows what the cost of production of that diamond was, okay? So this is a problem for the classical school. They couldn't explain things like diamonds, whose cost of production were much lower. Somebody may have found that diamond on a beach, or got it for a few days mining, okay? Certainly it didn't cost anywhere near $46 million, yet it sold for that price. So that's why the classical school failed in some sense. So what was they had an out. They had sort of what they believe was a solution. They said, well, economics is not concerned with explaining use value. Okay, that's internal to the human being. We're not interested in that. We're interested in explaining prices, okay, or the exchange value of a good on the market. Therefore, they claim that diamonds are more expensive than water because diamonds are very expensive to mine. They have a high cost of production, okay? So it costs more money to produce a carat of diamonds than it does to produce a gallon of water. And since we put aside use value, consumer satisfaction from the water or the diamonds really don't come into it. It does in some broad sense that for a thing to have a price, the classical school understood that humans have to want it, okay? But again, they talked in broad classes, not in specific concrete wants. So they adopted a cost of production theory of value, and once you do that, your focus then becomes on the businessman or the business decision maker, the entrepreneur, the person who is trying to find resources at a low price, form them into goods, and sell them at a high price. So it was a theory of calculated action, but it didn't go back to human wants and choices, okay? Now, the consumer then dropped out of the picture. Yes, the consumer wants these things, but the consumer does not in any way affect the value of these things. It's cost of production that determines the value. So classical economics became about the acquisition and accumulation of wealth by businessmen. And the satisfaction of consumer wants just dropped out. So even though, as I said, it was a very impressive structure of economic theory that the classical school developed, at its base, it was fundamentally flawed. Now, Menger, before he became an economist, and before he wrote his book in 1871, in the late 1860s, he was an economic journalist, and he watched markets. He watched commodities markets and stock markets, and he saw prices fluctuating wildly, much way out of proportion in some cases to their costs. So he thought about the classical school. He said, well, their theory is not realistic, okay? He wanted to know what the cause of prices and value were. So in his preface to his book, he wrote, I have devoted special attention to the investigation of the causal connections between economic phenomena involving products and the corresponding agents of production, that is the factors of production, the resources, not only for the purpose of establishing a price theory based on reality and placing all price phenomena together under one unified point of view. He wanted one price theory. He didn't want a different price theory for diamonds, which the classical school had, than they had for wheat or water, okay? Water and wheat had their value determined by cost of production. Diamonds had their value determined according to the classical school because they were scarce and they were monopolized. The scarcity caused a monopolization. So they didn't worry too much about that kind of side of the price theory. So Menger began what we call the causal realist tradition in economics, which is the tradition that is central to the Austrian School of Economics. So Austrians see economic theory as a way of investigating what are the causes of prices, wage rates, interest rates that are paid on real markets. Because that was what Menger was looking at. That was what he was trying to explain. Not what prices would be if we had equilibrium. That is, if there was little change in the economy. But in a real economy in which change is incessant, it's constant, and it occurs under uncertainty. So Menger wrote, before he wrote his book, he wrote out notes for himself. And he talked about what economics was all about in a way that was much different than the classical school did. So he wrote these notes to himself. First, he said, man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy. And that's going to mean something specific in a moment, and we'll get to that. He also said, our science is a theory of a human being's ability to deal with his wants. And finally, the first sentence, the very first sentence of his book is all things are subject to the law of cause and effect. Okay. So no talk of cost of production, no talk of a difference between subjective value and exchange value, or use value and exchange value. He did talk about those things, but showed that they were all integrated in his system of economics. Okay, so it was very important to him to talk about the causes of things, okay? The causes of real economic phenomena, real economic facts that we see in everyday life. So he also wrote out in his notes a series of 3 connected concepts that are connected by causality. So human beings have ends, okay? As we'll see in a moment, let's say eating a ham sandwich and satisfying your hunger might be your end. So the end is the satisfaction of a want, okay? Now that causes individuals to look around for things that can be combined to satisfy that want. So the means are what are used, and they're called goods in economics. The goods or the means are used then to realize the end. So things go from the subjective, this felt, Mises called it a felt uneasiness, this defect in us that we're not completely satisfied because we're hungry, among other things, okay? And we look at our environment, in our objective environment, so we go from subjective to objective. We look in our environment, we look for means that will help us satisfy the ends. That is, realize the ends that we're aiming at. And he used that triad of concepts. And notice he went from ends to means to realization, and then the realization of the ends. He also wrote out man's wants, his very existence as an acting being causes him to look around the external world, okay? That's the objective. You go from the subjective to the objective, and then back to subjective again, in order to produce subsistence so that he can live in that world. Okay? And finally, wants, goods, and satisfaction. And he got this from the French liberal economist, 19th century economist, Frederick Bastiat, who had written this in a book, that it's man's wants that causes economic action, or the search to acquire goods, to produce them, to find them, and so on. And once you've found those goods, you consume them, and that satisfied your wants. So, not to belabor the point, but all action begins in the human mind, uses elements of the objective world, and ends in the human mind with the satisfaction of wants, or the realization of ends. And here's the subjective and objective elements of action. The guy's hungry, right? And he knows that these means can be combined into a ham sandwich, and that ham sandwich will satisfy his want, will eradicate his hunger. Okay, so the guy's hunger causes him to put together these various means, combine them. That's production. The combination of means into a consumable good is what we define as production in Austrian economics. And then the sandwich is made. And now the sandwich itself doesn't have value, as we'll see in Austrian economics. It's not the sandwich. It's the bite of the sandwich. It's the consumption of the sandwich that serves to satisfy the want. The sandwich only has value because people know that it will, or believe that it will serve their wants, okay? That it will yield them services during the time of consumption, which will satisfy them. So that's very important. We'll see Menger completely understood this and showed that diamonds aren't expensive on the market, or don't have a high price on the market, because it's very, very costly to mine diamonds, but rather the other way around. The diamond mine has a high value because people desire or demand diamonds so urgently. Okay, so Menger came up with a theory of the good. That is, what is a good? Okay. The classical school just took it for granted that a good was something that people desired. But Menger said, in order to have something become a good, something in the real world out there, you need a human need, okay, that's be a human need or a desire for satisfaction. You have to know that a thing is capable of being brought into causal connection with the satisfaction of the need. You have to know that the ham sandwich will satisfy the need. There has to be human knowledge, actually, that's the third point, the human knowledge of the causal connection. And fourth, you have to have command of the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. You have to have ownership or control. For example, if you're going to a baseball game or a picnic, you have a great need for a sunny day and no rain, okay? But a sunny day isn't a good because you can't control the sun, or at least we can't now. We can't control the weather, okay? Now, Mises pointed out that Menger made a mistake, okay? And one of the few mistakes Menger made in his book. And that is that 2 and 3 are wrong. You don't just need a human knowledge of a causal connection between a thing in the objective world and your wants or needs. All you need is a belief that a thing has a capacity to cause the satisfaction of a human need. Now, Menger, a few pages later, talked about imaginary goods, goods that really didn't satisfy your needs, but you paid a price for. So he kind of recognized it. But Mises said that's no less a good. An imaginary good is no less a good than any other good. So if someone goes to a psychic to communicate with one of their deceased loved ones, that has a price, but it's nonsense. Someone reads the New York Times to get information about what's really going on in the world. I mean, that's an imaginary good. I mean, but yet, I mean, people pay a price for it. Okay. So what makes something an economic good? So Menger went a step further. An economic good is a good in which there is an insufficient amount of it to fulfill all human needs for it. So air in this room is a good in Menger's sense. Mises completely got rid of the term for air as a good, but in Menger's sense, it's a good, but it's not an economic good. There's more than enough for all of us. Now, air can become a good if you're deep sea diving, or if you're going into space, or if you have emphysema and it's a bad day in Los Angeles with the smog, okay, you will pay for air, okay? But otherwise, air, although it has a very, very high, in a classical sense, use value, okay, has no exchange value whatsoever. So that, as we'll see, is what Menger will solve that. So Menger talked about the economizing man. The classical economists talked about homo economicus, which was the economic man, the person who buys cheaply and sells at a higher price, okay? And that's the businessman. But Menger said, no, that's not the central figure in economics. The central figure in economics is the consumer, the economizing man, the person who will only use his or her resources to achieve the most valuable ends. Now we're coming up to the law of marginal utility, as Menger conceived it in a moment. So value and the law of marginal utility. So think of utility again in terms of satisfaction, and marginal means it's the least or next satisfaction, either the least satisfying use of a good that you have possession of, or the use of a good that you will use if you get one more unit of that good, okay? So marginal utility is a satisfaction from the least important or lowest ranked end served by the available supply of the good. Okay, that's how Menger conceived it, and that's the correct way to conceive it. It's not a sum of something. So for example, I went to, I'm a big Beatles fan, and I saw Paul McCartney a number of years ago in concert, And I think I paid $150 for a ticket, and that was more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was. So I then later on went to a Rod Stewart concert, and I paid $85 for the ticket, I think, or something like that. But if someone said, how much more did you like the Paul McCartney concert than the Rod Stewart concert? I couldn't say, well, I got 100 udels from Paul McCartney, but only 30 from Rod Stewart, okay? Because what the heck is a udel, okay? They use that in mainstream textbooks, the term udel, that you get certain quantities of satisfaction. But of course, a udel has no existence in reality, and you can't define it internally either, okay? It doesn't have any extension in time and space. We know what a pound is. We know what a foot is. We know what a column of mercury will tell us about outside the temperature. Those are all things that you can measure, okay? But you can't measure utility. In fact, in the 1930s, the famous economist Lionel Robbins, who for a long while was a close follower of Mises, pointed out that utility is like love, right? You can say you could be dating 3 different women, and you can settle on one as your spouse, and you can say, I love woman A more than woman B, and woman B more than woman C, and so therefore I'm going to marry her, okay? Utilities, you can't say how much more you love one woman than another, okay? So it's actually true that it's completely internal. Okay. So the law of marginal utility tells us that as a quantity of a good that you possess increases, the value of each unit of that good will decrease because each additional unit is devoted to a lower and lower satisfaction, a lower ranked satisfaction. So Menger used Robinson Crusoe as an example. Let's say Robinson Crusoe was shipwrecked on an island, which he is. I mean, that's the fictional character, and has wheat, okay? How will he allocate this wheat? How will he use this wheat? Well, he'll rank the uses of the wheat. Let's say the first sack of wheat that he reaps will be just enough to make bread to sustain his life. And the second will be able to make him more vital, sustain his health, allow him to live and make choices, whereas just the first one will just barely keep him alive. The third would be used for seed for next year, for next year's harvest. The fourth, he would want to vary his diet, so he would use it for feeding goats. Let's say there are wild goats on the island that he domesticates and gets milk and cheese and meat from them. Menger used whiskey as the fifth most important use. I like vodka, so I'll use vodka. And then if he only has 5 sacks of wheat. If he had a 6th, it would be devoted to an even less important want, and that would be to feed a parrot because he was so lonely on the island. And so on. He has many uses. So now the question becomes, what is the value of 1 sack of wheat? All 5 sacks are identical, right? They're all identical. They can all serve the same wants interchangeably. So how valuable is a sack of wheat? Is it the highest valued want? Is it equal to the satisfaction you get from sustaining your life, or is it equal to an average of all those wants? If you average them up and sort of try to figure out some kind of average satisfaction? No. He asks a very important question. He said, if let's say a pack of rats break in and devour one of the 5 sacks of wheat, let's say the third one, seed for the next harvest, which satisfaction will he lose? Let's assume he hasn't started using them yet. Always the lowest ranked satisfaction. So no matter what sack of wheat is lost, the marginal utility, the lowest satisfaction from that supply of wheat, is making vodka, okay? That's his value scale, not mine. So that's the satisfaction that he would go without. So that is the value of every sack of wheat. Now, if once he's lost that sack of wheat, what happens to the marginal utility of wheat? It goes up, and the value of each unit of the supply of 4 sacks of wheat is raised. So the fewer you have of units of a good, the higher the value is, okay? And I can give you a little quiz on this. Here's a farmer who has 3 horses and 2 cattle. Those animals are non-interchangeable. They're different. They have different uses, and they can't be used in the other's use, okay? So highest on his value scale, he has 3 horses, 2 cattle, is the first horse. Second highest is a second horse for hitching and making it easy, hitching to the plow and making it easier to produce wheat, okay? The third horse, the third most important want is for milk, which is served by the first cow. The fourth most important one is for beef, which is served by the second cow. And the fifth is a horse for recreational riding. Remember, he has 5 different units, 3 horses, 2 cows. Okay. Which animal is more valuable to the farmer? Now, the way to answer this is to think about losing one. So if there's a barn that he keeps all 5 of them in, and it's on fire, and he can only save 4, which one will he not save? Let's assume he can only save 4. Which is the one? The horse. The horse is the least valuable animal. Even though a horse serves the 2 most important wants, its marginal utility is lower than the marginal utility of the cow. The marginal utility of the cow is a satisfaction from the 4th end. The marginal utility of the horse is a satisfaction from the 5th end, okay? And that is how, we'll go back for a minute. That is how Robinson Crusoe, Carl Menger solved the diamond water paradox. If you're in a desert and you haven't had water for three days, and you have that intense, fancy pink diamond in your pocket, would you trade that for a gallon of water? Yes, you would, because the marginal utility of water is higher. It's the first end. That is to keep you alive for another 3 days. So you would make the trade. Now, why, though, are diamonds so much more expensive than water in a normal situation? Because water is so abundant that it serves very, very low valued end. Its marginal utility is very low compared to diamonds, which are much scarcer. Their marginal utility, the lowest ranked end that they serve for people, is much higher. So their value is higher, okay? And that's why air, which keeps us alive for more than 3 minutes, which we need to stay alive for more than 3 minutes, is only, has no value in a normal situation, is valueless, okay? So Menger also wanted to explain, and he didn't do it fully, but he gave us an idea of how we explain the value and prices of resources and the factors of production like land, labor, and capital goods. And again, he used the concept of causality. So production runs from, well, he divided production to stages, okay? So in this case, the production of an automobile requires first that the iron ore be mined, second that it be transformed into steel, third that the steel is transformed into various shapes, fourth, so let's say each one takes a year or half a year, whatever it might be. Fourth is to stamp out the shapes for the automobile. Fifth is the assembly plant, and then the sixth is the automobile dealer, who displays it and sells it at retail. But these are all different stages. Now, Menger called the stages furthest from the consumer the higher stages of production, and the stages closest to the consumer, the lower stages. And the consumption stage is called the final stage of production. So what happens is, in production, the cause goes from the highest stage to the lowest stage, okay? So you produce the iron ore, and then you add labor, and you combine labor and iron ore in a factory, and that combination causes the production of steel, and so on, until the assembly stage, bringing together workers and the parts for the automobile and an assembly line and a factory, that causes the production of the automobile, which in turn, when it's purchased by the consumer, causes the satisfaction of his wants for transportation, okay? So that's important. But now, the classical school realized this, but they said, well, if that production goes from the higher stages to the lower stages, so does value, right? So automobiles cost what they do because the steel costs what it does. The steel causes the value of the automobile, but that's not true. It's the exact opposite, as Menger pointed out. The value of the means is determined by the value of the ends that they serve, okay? As I mentioned before. So an automobile factory is extremely expensive, and the steel and all of those parts that go into components that go into making a car are extremely expensive, precisely because people value cars so much. If we lived in, I don't know if you've seen the old movie Witness with Harrison Ford, takes place in Amish country, and the Amish do not use automobiles, okay? They only use these horses and buggies to get around, okay? It's a religious thing, but if all Americans took on this value system of the Amish, would cars have any value? No matter how much it costs to produce cars, it would have no value. And therefore, an automobile plant would have no value. And workers specializing in producing automobiles, that particular skill would have no value on the market. So what Menger said is value is imputed backwards from consumer value judgments and the services of the consumer's good in satisfying wants to the consumer good itself. So from the services, from our wants and satisfying those wants, back to the consumer's good, all the way back up the stages of production to the highest stage. And Menger used tobacco as his example. He said, if there's no tobacco, if people realize that smoking is bad for their health, then the value of cigarettes and pipes and so on would fall to zero. But so would the value of tobacco leaves, and beyond that, the value of land that could be used to grow tobacco. Unless it could be used for something else that people desired, it would fall to zero, okay? Same thing is true of diamond mines. If people rejected diamonds as ostentatious and trivial and something that was conspicuous consumption, then the value of a jeweler's services, the value of the diamond mine itself would all fall to zero. So production goes from the higher stages, this is the production of bread, to the lower stages. You can see the blue arrow going downward. But value goes backwards. It goes from the lower stages up, okay? The farm tools are only valuable because the wheat itself is valuable, but the wheat is only valuable because it causes the production of the flour, which in turn causes the bread and causes the satisfaction for consumers. So causality goes the opposite way when we're talking about value. And then let me just finish this because I have about 3 minutes left. So Menger ended his book with the analysis of exchange. And he showed that people will always exchange or only exchange when the good that they are getting has a higher value to them than the good they're giving up. So in this example, the first example, the horses and the cow, the horse is, in parentheses, is the good that the person does not have, but values more than the cow. So person A is willing to give up a cow to person B, whereas person B is willing to give up the horse to person A in exchange for the cow. Why? Because in each case, what they're getting has a higher value, a higher marginal utility than what they're giving up. And that holds for modern trade, holds for all trade, everywhere and at all times. Here we have a seller of a BMW willing to give up the BMW in exchange for $70,000, which the seller values more than the car that he's giving up. And then the buyer, she values the car more than the $70,000 that she's giving up, okay? And this analysis of exchange was radically different from anything that had come before it. The classical school thought that goods exchanged because they were of equal value. But the Austrian school, starting with Menger, pointed out that goods are exchanged because there's a double inequality of value. Each person values the goods in reverse order, okay? So I will stop there, and thank you very much for listening. We now have a 15-minute break, but please be back in your seats before 10 o'clock.
Excuse me. Thank you, Paul. Hello, everybody. Hello. I think we'll get started now. Hello, everybody. Hello. I'm going to be. Thank you all for coming to my lecture on praxeology. I should tell you. The reason I'm sitting down is, I just flew in from Los Angeles last night and my legs are still tired. You must laugh at my jokes. This is a requirement. Anyone who doesn't laugh at my jokes is out. Yes, that wasn't a joke, but it's all right to laugh anyway. I should say I don't have any PowerPoints because I find that confusing. I once tried to solve that by just having 2 PowerPoints, but I couldn't manage that either. And I should say also, as you'll see, as you already know, I have a I'm not very soft voice, so if you can't hear me, just put up your hand. Of course, anyone who puts up his hand is lying. We have someone gets an A right away. All right, now what I'm going to do is I have a lecture on praxeology, and what I'm going to do is first talk about the concept of action. What is an action? Then I'm going to discuss how do we know we act. Then I'm going to give the deductive method that praxeology uses. The word praxeology can be used in 2 meanings, one of which is as a science of human action, and the other is the praxeological method, the distinct way of reasoning employed in praxeology. Then, after discussing the deductive method, I'm going to give something on the deductive logic. I'm going to give something on the ways in which the justification for praxeological reasoning, and then depending on the time that's left, I'll say something about methodological individualism. I should say I have good news and bad news. The bad news is, this is based on the experience, if you're anything like the students who've been coming through here when I had to give the lectures on praxeology for the past 40 years or so, you're going to find this very tough. This is the toughest lecture. But if the good news is, if you can get through my lecture, then the rest of the lectures will be easy. So that's the tough part. And I should say also, since my specialty is philosophy, I always like to give what my great friend Father James Sadowski, who was in the Jesuit order, said about philosophy. He said, philosophy comes from the Greek word philosophia, which means philosophy. Yes, so now, what is an action? An action is purposeful behavior. That's to say, we have in an action, we have a certain goal or end, and then we have means. We think that there's some way of getting what we want. We have some ideas of what we can do to achieve our wants, and then there's so we're using the means to achieve the ends. And one point which Professor Salerno made in the last lecture is very important, that when we talk about what the person takes as a means to an end, it's whatever the person thinks will achieve his end. It doesn't matter whether in fact it will or not. He could have mistaken ideas that are factually mistaken about what will enable him to achieve his end. But as long as he thinks that they will achieve the end, that is sufficient. For example, suppose someone believes that if he wants to cause pain to someone who's an enemy of his, and he believes that the way to do that is to make a wax effigy of the person and stick pins in him, it probably won't work. At least it hasn't worked the past few times I've tried it. We have a real fan here. Good. But as long as the actor thinks that it will work, that's enough. And Mises says in this connection, he thinks that all action is rational in that it involves at least from what the actor takes to be a way of achieving his end. Now, another point about action that is very important is that the future has to be uncertain. But if you think that something is going to happen regardless of what you do about it, then you're not going to act. Now, one point that I think is people sometimes miss, and here I have my view on this is perhaps a bit different from what some other people might say, is that it has to be the case that when you're thinking about what's uncertain, you can take into account, you can know what you're going to do in the future. That's something that you can, is not part of the uncertainty. Say something like, suppose somebody always has the same thing for breakfast. He always has scrambled eggs with tomatoes. So he knows that, say, tomorrow he's going to have scrambled eggs with tomatoes. That's something that doesn't count as part of the uncertain knowledge. Now, the thing I like best about philosophy is there are always objections and counter-objections. And some people say, no, well, in that case, you would be deciding what you couldn't predict what you were going to do, because at the time, say it came to tomorrow, you could change your mind. And if you changed your mind, then you wouldn't have eggs and tomatoes for breakfast. You could always change your mind. But that doesn't seem like a very good argument to me, because you could, that's just what's begging the question. You could say, that's just what the issue is under dispute. Can you change your mind or not? It isn't a good argument that you can always change your mind to take as a premise. You can always change your mind. That isn't entirely convincing. Okay, so supposing that's what action is, how do we know we act? And here, some people, I think, make this into a big mystery. They say, I can know that I act because I know what's in my own mind. Say, I know what I decided to do. Say, when you're looking into your mind, you could think, you know you're here in this lecture room because you wanted to come to my lecture, you now realize that's a big mistake, but it's too late now. But they say, well, I can't know what other people think. I can only know what's in my own mind. But here, I think the thing to bear in mind is that praxeology, or Austrian economics, is one of the sciences, and the sciences don't try to solve philosophical problems like how do we know there are other minds. It's something that's obvious to us, that's just taken as something we can take as given. Say, if one of you asks me a question, I don't say, well, there are some sounds coming out of that person's mouth, so maybe one explanation for that is that the person has thoughts similar to the kind of thoughts I have when I utter sentences. No, I just take it as obvious that the person is talking and thinking, so is acting. And if someone said, oh, but isn't it logically possible that the person isn't acting, but they're just sounds coming out of his mouth, or that there's no action really taking place? Well, I don't think it's a logical contradiction, but there are all sorts of things that are not logical contradictions that it would nevertheless be absurd to think. For example, suppose one of you is really a rabbit who's has a very a carefully designed human costume. So you you're giving the impression that you're a human being, but you're actually a rabbit. I don't think that's contradictory, but that's not a logical contradiction. It would nevertheless be absurd to believe that. It would be something that we rightfully take to be impossible, and we wouldn't want to. Most people don't have the attitude that they like the character in Alice in Wonderland, who wanted 6 impossible things served up to him every day for breakfast. So most of us don't believe in impossibility. So I would say it's just obvious that we act. And some people will, I know from past experience, will say, oh, no, all I really know is what's in my own mind. And I should say there, I don't understand what's meant by really know in that connection. We know in the ordinary language sense in which we know all sorts of things. All right, now I want to, after talking about action, I want to say something about the deductive method that's used. And many people spend a lot of time, and I'll be talking about this myself, in wondering what is the basis, what is the logical justification for the action axiom, the proposition that all men act. And they spend a great deal of time saying, is this a priori? Is it a priori synthetic? Is it a necessary truth? But it's much more important, in my view, to start with deduction. And deduction has the remarkable property that if we start with true premises that are true and we reason correctly, then it's guaranteed that the conclusion is true. So we distinguish here between validity and soundness. So supposing we say all men are mortal, Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a valid form of reason. It's a valid syllogism. The conclusion follows from the premises. And in this case, the premises are true. But what happens if we have a false premise? What is the relation? What happens then if, say, one of our or both of our premises are false? So in that case, the argument would be called unsound. So a sound argument has to have true premises. If one of the premises is false, then the argument isn't have this property be sound. So let's take, supposing we have something like this, all ostriches are all ostriches are mammals. All mammals are apes. Therefore, all ostriches are apes. That's correctly deduced, but both premises are false. So you can't, the conclusion, you don't know that you can't say that the conclusion, since the conclusion is false, you can't say the argument is sound. It's valid, but not sound. So then we have the question, what kind of logic are we using? Is it, some of you had courses in mathematical logic or symbolic logic. This isn't the kind of logic that's used in the Austrian reasoning. It's just reasoning in ordinary language. And we have to use ordinary language. Why do we do that? Because we want to understand every step of the reasoning. If we have, we use symbolic logic, once we've set up the premises symbolically, then we just apply the rules of the logical system we're using, like first order predicate calculus. That's about as far as I got. But we then come up with a conclusion. We can translate the conclusion back into ordinary language and understand it, but this isn't we won't be able to understand every step of what we're doing. So also, if we go according some people say, well, but this type of logic, ordinary language, isn't rigorous. It depends on just people getting kind of these the terms aren't exactly defined, the basic terms, and so isn't it better to use the symbolic logic that is more exactly defined? But this objection has only one problem. It's not true, which I think is a fairly good objection to something. If you look at any standard logic text or any text, say in mathematics, which is also strictly deduced, you'll find that the basic terms aren't defined. Let's take an example. In set theory, there isn't, if you ask what is the definition of a set, there isn't one. There's people are just supposed to get an intuitive idea of a set as a collection of some sort. We can say a set is something that we can follow the basic, that we can apply the basic principles of set theory to, but there's no definition of set. And also, as the great logician W.V.O. Quine pointed out, the way we set up the rules in logic is that we work them out so what our ordinary language reasoning is what turns out to be, will come out right. Sort of if we didn't use the terms correctly, then, I mean, if the axioms and rules we use came out with what seemed to go against common sense reasoning, then we would just revise the system in some way so what we got was correct. And the great thing about deduction is that once you start, if you start with a true premise, you can reason, you can then draw conclusions from it, and if you're reasoning soundly, then you'll be able to learn all sorts of new knowledge. Now, some people object to, they say, well, that's just in logic, just consists of a tautology, which is really something that is just a statement of something that's true by definition, and we're just making, in Austrian economics, we're just assuming certain things are just true by definition. For example, suppose, to give something that Professor Salerno was talking about in the last lecture, suppose you say you will always choose your highest valued want. So the objection is you're just defining your highest value want as the one you choose. So that isn't really saying anything, but that isn't, so how does one respond to that? In one way, which is that adopted by Mises, is that what he called he accepted this, which I think is rather surprising. I think one really shouldn't accept it, but Mises did. But he said, well, there's what we could call the useful tautology, because he said, look, as an example, it's been argued, at least by some people, that mathematics consists of tautologies, but we wouldn't say that for those parts of math that does consist of tautology, we wouldn't say that we can't be surprised by some very complicated theorem that we proved. So it's a useful tautology. But Rothbard, I think, had an answer that more directly strikes to the heart of the matter, is that we're not saying when you always choose your most highly valued want, you're not saying you choose whatever you choose. You're saying you have in mind certain options, and you pick the one that's the highest, that you rank highest. And we can see that it isn't a tautology, because there are some people who are credible philosophers who've denied that. They say it makes sense to say something is your top choice. I mean, your top preference, but you choose something else. So in the Austrian view, no, that's wrong. We can take it as we say this is something that's implied in the notion of action, that we always choose our highest value option. So I think some people, I think the reason I think people are attracted to this is that there are some, they think, well, there are some statements that are genuine tautologies, such as Wittgenstein's example, it's either raining or it's not raining. That doesn't tell you much about what the weather is. If somebody says, how's the weather? You say, well, it's either raining or not raining. That wouldn't tell you much, but it wouldn't follow from that all statements that appear to be tautologies really, or that all tautologies are useless. So that's, if you accept this tautology point, that would be a good reply to it. Now, okay, so now we get to the question, what is the justification for the action axiom that all men act? That's politically incorrect now. We're supposed to say all human beings act. But so how do we know that? Now, here again, there's a difference between Mises and Rothbard. What Mises said was that this is something that is known a priori. What did he mean by that? Is an a priori proposition is one that can be known just by thinking about it. So when we talk about a priori proposition, we're not talking about how we got the concepts that we're using. Some people say, well, isn't Mises' view false because we get our concepts from we see various particulars, we see various items in the world, and we abstract what they have in common. For example, I could see various types of human being, and I get the notion of a human being from abstraction. But this doesn't speak to the question of whether we're talking about a priori truth or not, because that's how we got the concept, and the a priori knowledge is about, once we've got the concept, how we know it's true. So what Mises claimed is that if we think about the question, how do we all human beings act, we can just we understand that this is involved. This is what's involved. We see that this is part the concept of part of the concept of human being is that human beings are actors. Now, you might object that doesn't tell you whether there actually are any actors in the world. That just says that's part of the concept. And so Mises could admit that. He could say, well, he admits that. He says, you need the statement, there are human beings, and then once you know that, then you know that all the concepts, the a priori proposition is true, and anything that's deduced from that, validly deduced from that, is also true. Now, Rothbard takes a rather different view. He says that the action axiom is a necessary truth. What is the difference when we talk about a priori? That's a matter of epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. How do we know that something is true? And what's necessary has to do with what is the case. What's called in philosophy would be ontology or metaphysics. What is the case, not how we know that. Now, Rothbard claimed that in some instances, we can grasp that some propositions are necessary. What does necessary mean? It's something that must be the case, that can't be otherwise. For example, if someone is a human being, that's part of the essence of the person, that he's a human being. You can't say, well, what would happen if he wasn't a human being, because it's something that must be the case. So Rothbard said we could directly grasp that the statement human beings act is true, and he said he could call that a priori, but that's just what he means by a priori. So it's a different view from that of Mises. So now, I wanted I don't have much time remaining, but in the time remaining, I want to mention an objection to that was given by the logical positivists, who were a group the so-called Vienna Circle, who a group founded by the Austrian philosopher Moritz Schlick, and they had members such as Rudolf Carnap was one of the main members of it, Otto Neurath and others. And incidentally, I should say talk about the Vienna Circle illustrates the dangers of being a philosopher, because one of Professor Schlick's students was a man named Knobloch, and he wasn't very satisfied with the way Professor Schlick was handling things. It's unclear what was bothering him, but he expressed his dissatisfaction in a rather definite way, came up to him and shot him dead. I mean, that's really showing your dislike for someone. So I'm not going to be able to have much time for the objection, the logical positive objection, but I thought that was a better story than their objections anyway. But their main objection was, they said, any true proposition has to be verifiable. There must be some way of showing it's false, and that isn't a very good objection because, as sometimes pointed out, there's no way of showing that very principle is false. It's just something that's assumed. So people will, the usual response will be, well, that's just a proposal, but then if it's just a proposal, why don't we reject it? And nobody nobody really takes them seriously in analytic philosophy anymore. So that is, I think the final thing I'll say in the last minute, I've talked about in logic we can avoid contradictions. There are some people who willingly embraced contradictions. Remember, it was Oscar Wilde who said that consistency is the final refuge of the unimaginative. So thanks. I'm out of time now, so thanks very much for coming to my lecture.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to begin this session on subjective value of market prices. I'm glad to hear the energy that is in this room, given your wake-up call this morning. So I understand there might be a repeat of this, so you might want to adjust your evening schedules to accommodate another episode of the kitchen setting off the alarm. Well, in any case, in the first 2 days of Mises University, what we do as a faculty is we lay the foundation of Austrian economics, and you'll see over these 2 days that this foundation could be summarized in the concept that Mises called economic calculation. That this is really the foundation for understanding all social economies, not just the market economy, but by comparing and contrasting the market economy, all other economies. And the cornerstone of this foundation of economic calculation is what we're going to talk about in the next 45 minutes, which is the theory of market prices. Now we're going to do this in 4 steps. So the first thing we'll talk about is just some of the fundamentals of human action that are necessary for us to build out this theory of prices. And then second, we're going to talk about how the logic of human action operates in each of our own personal economies. What can we say? What's the logical structure of human action when we think about our own circumstances and our own choices and so on? And that's a necessary step to move to the social economy, because it doesn't take too much to see this. The social economy is just when we integrate our personal economies, right? We come into association with other people. And especially important, of course, is the concept of the division of labor. So we'll talk about that transition, and then when we're finished with that, we'll jump into the theory of price and go through the logic of it. So let's start with the fundamentals. Human action is purposeful behavior of human beings. That is, every human action, a person is striving to attain an end or a goal that they have in mind. And it's quite obvious that simply having an end that you wish to attain doesn't constitute action. In order to act as human beings, we have to first identify means that can be applied usefully to the attainment of the end. We have to acquire these means, and then we have to organize them in a manner of complementarity of the different things we're using as means as we act to attempt to attain the end. We also notice from the very beginning, when we start to reflect upon human action, that when we engage in action, the action itself does not indefinitely attain the end that we pursue. Sometimes action will fail to meet our expectations about the attainment of an end. But more commonly, what we have in mind is that, we get tired again. We need to sleep, right? We get hungry again after eating, and we need to eat again, and so on and so forth. That this is the idea in economics of scarcity, right? We always have unmet ends, in other words, at any given moment in time. The other thing that we'll note here that is important for these fundamental principles is that when we engage in action, we find out, empirically, we find out in the world that means are not entirely specific to the usefulness of any particular end, but instead they can be moved from one thing to another. The most obvious instance of this that we're all familiar with is our labor, right? We can take our labor and shift it from the production of one thing to the production of another. And there are different degrees of this, as we say, specificity of different factors of production that we'll talk about in later lectures. But here we just want to note that this is the case. So notice we can sum all of this up. When we talk about human action, we talk about economizing. That is, we choose, with the means that we have, we choose to pursue the attainment of higher valued ends, setting aside lesser valued ends. And for any end that we pursue, we choose to arrange the means that we're going to apply to the attainment of the end in a way that keeps the sacrifice of other ends that we could attain minimized, right? So we have these two margins of economizing choice, choosing between different ends we could pursue, choosing between different combinations of means that we could apply to attain any one of these ends. And this is where we get to the principle of valuation. So how is this done when we just think about our own personal actions? This is done by, as Mises like to say, by personal valuation, a personal judgment that we make about what's important to us, what our purposes are, and a personal judgment that we make about the availability and the access that we have to the different means that we might apply to act in an attempt to attain this end. So when we're engaged in action, since our means are scarce, we're always rank ordering the value of things. We're always saying, this end is now more valuable to me to pursue than the alternative that I could have engaged in. Our choice demonstrates this, right? And this is the idea in economics that Mises like to call preference. We have a preference that's demonstrated in action by choosing the higher valued end to pursue at that moment, setting aside a lesser valued end, choosing the least cost, least opportunity cost arrangement of the factors of production as opposed to a higher opportunity cost arrangement. Now, valuation has two important characteristics. One of these is what, again, in the Austrian economics, we call the subjectivity of value. And the subjectivity of value simply means that value is a state of mind. Value has no extensive property outside the mind of the person valuing. And therefore, it cannot be measured. There is no unit of value that we could come up with by which we could engage in measurement. And you could see that as a consequence of this, we can't compare the amount of value that one person gets from acting with the amount of value that another person gets. The whole notion of an amount of value is fallacious. There isn't any amount of value. Value is just a state of mind, right? A judgment of the mind. So that's one feature. And the second feature is that value is not constant. That is to say, there is no quantitatively constant relationship between objective features of the world, the configuration of them, and the empirical result of our action. By the way, we know this because all of us have engaged in action in the past where we regret having done it. Why would we regret having done it if we had some kind of deterministic relationship between the objective features of the world and the action we take and then the objective result? So it's important to keep these concepts in their proper logical, kind of narrow logical configuration. Okay, so now the question becomes, once we have this as background, the question becomes, we want to transition again to this personal economy. The question becomes, if we value an end, if that's where value comes from, or the source of it, right, is the judgment of our mind with respect to the importance of attaining the end, how does this value get assigned to means? Okay, well, there are three possibilities. There are three logical possibilities, right? The top line is the Austrian view of value imputation. It says the value of a consumer good is derived from the value of the end that it helps attain. So the arrow of causality is moving from left to right. And consumer goods are defined as directly serviceable to the attainment of the end. So it's like, what are we having for lunch? It's like whatever we get for lunch, right? We get a Chick-fil-A sandwich, and we eat the sandwich. It's a consumer good. And then producer goods are the goods that are used as means to make the consumer good, right? And so the Austrian theory of how value gets integrated by the human person's, in the human person's mind, it gets integrated into an economy, right? Which is constituted by acquisition of means, production, consumption, these basic acts that we're all familiar with. Valuation of the human person integrates all this into an economy. And so the value of producer goods is assessed by the person with respect to the contribution that each producer good in combination makes to the production of the consumer good, and then the consumer good it has a value imputed to it as an aid to the attainment of the end itself. The classical view of this, as you heard earlier this morning, or at least one of the classical views, reverses the causal order of things and says that the price of the consumer good is determined by the cost of production, that is the prices of the or value of the producer goods. And then the final step, as we move from the consumer good from right to left to the mind, is that the mind must somehow conform to this valuation, right? So the Austrian position is consistent with what we said already about ends and means. It's logically consistent with the very notion we have of ends and means, whereas this cost of production theory contradicts it. And then the neoclassical view, especially in the work of Alfred Marshall, says that the consumer good prices are co-determined independently by subjective value of the minds of buyers and the objective cost of production. And of course, this can't be the case. Again, if the logic of human action is correct as we stated it, this is just illogical, right? It couldn't look quite like this. Now, we're not resolving all of the issues involved in working this out, but I'm just doing this again to sort of alert you to what you're going to see in the next couple of days. So let's turn to the personal economy. I mentioned this already. In the personal economy, each of us engages by this process of valuation within the circumstances in which I find ourselves, right? We engage in this process of the acquisition of consumer goods, and then the production, and producer goods, and then the production of various consumer goods, and then acts of consumption, right? And we're all familiar with this. I'll give you a few examples from my own recent experience to illustrate this. And then the question arises, are there economic laws that operate in the personal economy? And yes, indeed, there are two of these that we want to mention. The first are the laws of utility. Now here I'll give you a personal example of something that my wife and I decided to do in terms of producing a consumer good just last week. So we contracted with construction. You know, we never hired any concrete person to come and pour a patio for us and so on. And the thing that I've illustrated here in the preference rank is the first law of utility, which is, what value would my wife and I place on a second 12 by 14 new patio? The concrete guy could have easily done this, right? He could have poured another patio. We got space for another patio pad to be poured. But you could see that, no, we're going to economize, right? We're going to do the most important thing first, the most valuable thing first, and then with the next unit of the same good, it would have less value to us. It would be in a different place. It wouldn't satisfy the same utility, so to speak, that we get for the first one. In fact, by the way, we've already come up with what we would have done with the second pouring of a pad of concrete 12 by 14. My son and his wife also live in the same town, Grove City, Pennsylvania is where we're from. And they bought this house, which hopefully some of you will also be able to do when you get a little bit older. And they've got this old crummy concrete pad that's all busted up and no good. And that's what we would do if we were going to do a second one. We'd get the contractor to come back and pour a 12 by, well, whatever the size, but might be a different size or whatever. Pour them a nice concrete pad, you know. That would be nice. But we didn't do that first. In fact, we haven't done that yet. So shows you where the priorities are at the moment. So there are two laws of utility. What we've illustrated here is the first law of utility, as Murray Rothbard liked to call it, that if a person has a larger stock of a good, the value the person places on a unit of it is lower. Right? So if you have more units of a good, the value of a given unit is lower ranked than if you have fewer units of a good. And then the second law of utility is that more units of a good is preferred to fewer units of a good. As long as you don't have so many units of the good that it's super abundant and no longer scarce to you, then these laws hold, right? And these laws regulate the personal economy. This is why we didn't, get the contractor to do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 new patio pads. We stop because the second unit isn't worth as much to us. And then there's a second important basic principle, which is the law of returns. And here again, I'll just use a personal example. I already mentioned that my wife and I live in Grove City, Pennsylvania, Sylvania. It's all woods. We live out in the country. It's a forest. And so, the area where our house is, it was all the trees were cut down and the yard put in, and so just outside the house, it's just a forest. And we have this really nice wood stove in our walkout basement, so we burn wood in the winter. And so we need firewood. Now, sometimes we just buy the firewood. We just use the division of labor to get it. Sometimes I take my chainsaw and I cut a tree. And then I, chop it into sections, right? Limb it, chop it into sections, and split it. So I've got an axe and a sledgehammer and a wedge and all the stuff you need to split wood. Now, again, when my wife and I first moved to Grove City, I didn't have any of that stuff because it wasn't in my personal economy to do it. We lived in the city. We just had this little tiny, plot, and there were no trees on it. And I wasn't going to cut down any of the trees anyway. But now it's nice to have a chainsaw. Nice to do this. We've chosen to do this, right? This is the point within our circumstances. So what happens when I go out and I cut a tree and I get the wood prepared and then I split the wood and so on and so forth? Well, I don't get the same effect every time I do this. And the reason for this in the particular circumstance is that the tree, where the trees are and what kind of trees there are in our land are diverse. This is real diversity. They're not in the same place. They're not the same kind of trees. Not all wood burns the same. They're not the same distance from the house. They're not positioned relative to the other trees where if you cut them, they fall nicely, where it's easy to cut them into sections and so on. And so when I choose to cut a tree, I always cut the tree that's going to give me the greatest production, right? I economize. And so I cut a tree, I get maybe 2 cords of firewood from 6 hours of labor. Just cutting the tree, chop it into sections, split the wood, right? But if I did a second one, I wouldn't get that result. The marginal physical product, the MPP, would go down. And this is where we get to the principle of the law of returns. So the law of returns says that when we're engaged in physical production processes with complementary factors of production, where we can vary one of the factors of production and leave the others fixed in amount. I only have one chainsaw, I only have one yard with a certain number of trees and so on. That's not changing, but I'm adding more and more labor to it, right? Then there must be an optimal amount of the variable factor. That's what the law of returns says. Optimal means I get the greatest output per unit of the variable factor. And you can see in my example, I get diminishing returns right from the very start. I don't have a period of increasing returns and constant returns or decreasing returns. With cutting firewood, you get diminishing returns right from the start. So if I have diminishing returns, I'm not liable to, just cut firewood all day long. Or devote an entire week to cutting firewood 6 hours a day for the whole week, because I don't get the same value. I don't get the same aid in attaining my ends if I do it that way. So we put together, in our personal economies, we put all of this together, right? We organize it. The different things that we do, the different acts of consumption and production, and whether we use the division of labor to help us in this process or not. So this gets us then to the social economy. Now it's pretty clear that we engage in the social economy because of the greater, there could be other reasons, right? But the logic of that we're looking at here in action is we get greater productivity and therefore greater value from doing it. And again, just take the chainsaw example. I couldn't produce a chainsaw by myself. I couldn't do it, right? So I rely on some chainsaw manufacturers. Steel actually is my go-to chainsaw. And so I've got a Steel 390 chainsaw, if you're interested in chainsaws. And okay, so the steel company did, I don't know who the entrepreneur is, but he arranged the production, right? And hired a bunch of workers, and he did the same thing. He bought materials from other producers, right? And so we've got this social economy. And the social economy gives us tremendous gains in our productivity and therefore our standard of living. So we want to engage in this social economy. We want to interact with each other. And we do this, again, you'll hear about this in other lectures, along the lines of comparative advantage. And this applies also to the entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who organize each of the production processes also do so based upon their comparative advantage in operating these things. And remember, here we're just talking about the logic of voluntary activity. We're not talking about, Elon Musk or, heavily government subsidized production processes or something like this. So the last step then, before we get to the theory of price, in thinking about this, is just to point out that if we didn't have market prices, if we didn't have voluntary exchange and monetary prices, and entrepreneurs were left with making decisions about what to produce and how to combine various producer goods in their businesses in order to produce the things that they're trying to create and then sell, they would be unable to economize their decisions. If they based these decisions just on their own personal valuations, well, then they could not economize for the rest of us, right? If we're in a division of labor, each of us is producing to satisfy the consumptive ends of other people. And so we need to have some objective evidence that we're doing that when we're choosing to, when the entrepreneur of the steel chainsaw company is choosing to produce those chainsaws. They have to have some objective evidence that other people value the chainsaw as a product more than the other things that could have been produced with the same set of resources. And this is where we get to what Mises called appraisement. So appraisement is when the assessment of economizing relies not just on valuation. All human action relies on valuation, But as an adjunct, it integrates into valuation monetary prices, or the monetary result, we might say, of acts of production and then in this case exchange. Okay, so that's why price theory is so important, because we haven't shown this, I'm just saying it, right? We haven't demonstrated logically that this is the case. That in other words, if we have a unhampered market and we're engaged in voluntary exchange of private property in a monetary regime, that this it overcomes the limitations of valuation. Okay, so we're going to go to that next. And here I've just sketched out the theory. This is the Austrian price theory in sketch. So it starts, as we've mentioned already, just with preferences that we have for different things. And then if our preferences differ, we'll show this in a minute. Some people who have the good, so we're on the second line now, might be willing to supply a consumer good to others who are demanding the consumer good, if they can find a mutually agreeable or advantageous price. And then the prices of consumer goods emerge from the trade, right? And when the prices of consumer goods emerge from the trade, it has two consequences, for newly produced goods at least. It generates revenue for the entrepreneur. So I went down, bought the chainsaw several years ago, paid whatever, I don't even remember what I paid for it. Let's say $600 I paid for it. And that's revenue for the steel company, right? Steel's S-T-I-H-L. Good German company. And expenditure for me. Right? And then the revenue that comes into the hands of the entrepreneur from selling the good to consumers provides the funding that the entrepreneur can use to demand producer goods. So now we're on the line below revenue on the right-hand side. We fund through our own purchases or voluntary purchases of the goods that the entrepreneurs produce. We fund their demand for inputs. And then if we buy enough of the product, they'll have enough funding to outbid the other entrepreneurs who also want to use the same resources. Steel, basic resources, right? Steel and energy and other things that all the entrepreneurs are bidding for. And then the prices of producer goods emerge from this demand on the entrepreneur side, and then the supply of just regular persons again who own the basic producer goods, labor and land and so on. And then again, we've got all sorts of supply of producer goods that would be done by the intermediate production by entrepreneurs of different capital goods. And again, you'll follow up on that point during the first 2 days. And then when we have prices of producer goods, they'll generate costs for the entrepreneur. And now the entrepreneur can arrange factors of production to keep monetary costs lower than other arrangements of factors of production, right? And these prices of producer goods generate income for the producers, for the workers and the landowners and so on and so forth. And this income, of course, becomes one of the circumstances within which people then express their preferences. So my wife and I, we've worked and we have this income, and that's part of the circumstances within which we buy a new concrete patio or whatever the product might be. So you can see that there's a completeness to the logic of what we're presenting. Now, just again, so you see the import of this, the appraisement is done. We showed one of this on the previous slide, right? The appraisement is done first for production decisions, where we might call this gross profit is calculated by the entrepreneur, the revenue from selling the output, netting out the costs from buying the inputs. And if this is positive or sufficiently positive, then this would be an economizing use of resources. The resources are bid away from other competing entrepreneurs who are paying the prices for them, and they're allocated to this particular entrepreneur's production. And when the entrepreneur sells the output to consumers, they generate enough monetary revenue to more than cover the costs. So the resources are shifting out of areas where they're less valuable and into areas where they're more valuable, as expressed by our voluntary purchases or refusal to purchase goods. And then the other thing that we'll mention, and again, we'll follow up on this in other lectures, is that the second form of economic appraisement that's important that you'll see, especially tomorrow, is investment decisions. And this is in the balance sheet of equity calculations, right? We have asset prices on the left-hand side of the balance sheet, liabilities on the right. And entrepreneurs are continuously thinking about rearranging the ownership of their assets, disposing of some where liabilities are above asset values, right? Disposing of those, and then acquiring those where the asset values are above liability values. So they're constantly moving resources, both the things they own and the things that they're renting or purchasing from other resource owners. There's this constant churning of the movement of resources away from things that people value less highly and toward things people value more highly. So now let's go through, we want to go through the kind of nuts and bolts of that diagram that I gave you before of the, just the outline of the theory, the Austrian theory of prices. And just to make sure that you see that it is correct to think of the price of consumer goods as determined by preferences alone, that is preferences in our situation. The preferences are never abstract completely, right? They're always preferences of particular people and particular places and times and circumstances. But it's just that cost of production have nothing to do with supplies and demands. These are just determined, the cost of production are also determined by preferences. So just to see that fully, let's start with an example of a used durable consumer good. So we start with an example of a used durable consumer good because once a consumer buys a consumer good, the consumer, nobody involved in the trade after that knows anything about the cost of production. So my example is going to be a one-year-old iPhone. So somebody a year ago bought the iPhone 15. This is person B on the right-hand side. And person B doesn't know the cost of production of the iPhone 15. So cost of production can't enter into person B's decision to supply or not supply the iPhone, to sell it secondarily, right? And person B then meets person A and they hit it in their friends, and person A sees the iPhone 15 the person B has, kind of likes it, and they talk about, what would trading, or, buying it, and so on and so forth, and they come up with this trade. And you can see that the maximum buying price of person A for the iPhone 15 is $450 in my example. If B were to hold out for $460, person A wouldn't buy the iPhone 15. And the minimum selling price for person B is $425 because person B would prefer that to keeping the iPhone. And so they can make a trade, right? Maximum buying price above minimum selling price. They can find some price intermediate where it'd be mutually advantageous. And what would the price be? Well, whatever they negotiate. In my example, it's going to be $430. That's where the price comes from, right? No cost of production are involved. It's just the preferences of the two traders. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, just again to see the logic of this, the logic of this looks, just to spell it out, looks like this. The preference of the buyer is the value of the good to the buyer, the subjective value of the good to the buyer, right, is above the subjective value of the money that the buyer gives up. If that's the case, then they're willing and able to buy. And the value of the money given up to the seller is either to keep it for his or her own personal use, or to use it to bid for the good with a different seller who's maybe more eager to sell the good. So if you have a good like money, you can either keep it or you can trade it away. If you traded it to person B, well, you could always trade it to person C or person D or person E or whatever, right? So that's the logic of it. And for the seller, well, it's just reversed, right? If they make a trade, it's reversed. The seller, the value of the money to the seller is ranked above the value of keeping the iPhone. And what are the logical possibilities of valuing, keeping the iPhone? Well, you either keep it for your personal use, you just keep it and use it as a phone. You're doing that before anyway. Or instead of selling it to A, you sell it to C. You shop it around, right? Put it out on eBay. See if you can get a better deal. But if you own a phone, you either keep it and use it for yourself or you trade it away. Okay, you could give it away, but we're just looking at prices, right? So we have a law of demand. Remember, the law of demand is based upon the laws of utility that we mentioned before. If a buyer A is going to buy, or this person A is going to buy one iPhone, he be willing to pay the price to get all of the uses to which this one iPhone could be put. Well, how much would he be willing to buy at the same moment he buys the one? How much would he be willing to buy to pay to buy a second one? Well, it would have to be less because, just like with my concrete patio, the second unit of iPhone 15 would be worth less to him. What would he do with it? And we get a law of supply, same thing, right? Same logic. Of course, it's likely that the seller, person B, only has one iPhone 15, but it might have two, who knows? And if they had two, well, they'd sell one at some price, but the second one, they would hold out for a higher price. Why? Because you're using it for the more valuable use, right? You're shifting it to the more valuable use, and so it would take a higher price, at least at that moment, to do that. So what we like to do just visually is represent it this way. So now we're looking at a market demand and a market supply. And in my examples, I suggested that the market clearing price is $430, and the quantity sold on that day or that moment was 210. But this is just a sort of graphic way to visually represent what's really happening. What's really happening is exactly what we looked at a moment ago, which is we have one buyer and one seller coming together, and they make a trade, and as Mises like to say, at that point, they're in a plain state of rest. In other words, at that point, they're satisfied. They don't want to keep trading. They traded, and they've gotten the gains from the trade, and then they go on to do something else, right? This is all we're saying, really, in the diagram. In real life, it isn't that. The diagram is sort of covering that up, right? In real life, what's happening is you just get these trades. Moment by moment, you're getting people engaged in these trades. And every time they trade, if they don't continue to trade with this person, they stop, then they're in a market clearing point. The quantity demand, the quantity supplied are the same between those two people. And then you have, hundreds or thousands or millions of two-way trades. Of course, it could be three people trading together or four or whatever. But the point is, they're in a plain state of rest. That's the logic of it. The market is always clearing then, right? So this is the idea behind the diagram. Now let's go to the more interesting case, I guess. This is the case of, what about the new iPhone? What about the iPhone 16? And if you're familiar with how this works, with Tim Cook and his entrepreneurial group, what they do and are doing with the iPhone 16, as far as I know, is that they launch it sometime in October. They start shipping them out, right? They get pre-orders, they start shipping them out. $799 for the base model. And they'll sell anybody an iPhone any day of the year hence, right? If they start on October 1st or whatever, selling them, then until October 1st, 2026, anybody who wants to buy, get on their website, anybody who wants to buy at $799, they'll sell it at $799. You see, this is an entrepreneurial strategy, right? It's a business strategy. Their ask price is staying the same throughout the whole model year. Now, in contrast, that's not the only way that this can be done, right? So if you look at the stock price of Apple, it doesn't stay the same, does it? It moves continuously for every minor movement in supply and demand. And that is market clearing in financial markets. Why? Well, because traders in financial markets want to get the gain that they anticipate through making their trades, right? Selling short or buying long, whatever. They want to get the gain. They don't want somebody interfering and keeping the price the same all over, through the year or whatever. That would defeat the whole interest that they have. But consumers, apparently, we buying these phones, we sort of like that stability. Apparently, because that's the way they do it, the entrepreneurs do it. And so my diagram, and I do this again just to illustrate the point that there's nothing really, we're not drawing any necessary implications from the diagram. The diagram is just a simple way to illustrate the logic. And in this particular case of entrepreneurial strategy, the logic is that instead of thinking just about each two-pair trade, here we're talking about how does Apple come up with the price $7.99? And the answer is they think about the total sales that they're going to get over the whole model year. And then they think about what price should we ask, given what we think competitors are going to do and so on and so forth. What price should we ask if we're going to do this that would generate the most revenue for us over the model year? Because we're going to leave the price the same. That's our intent anyway. Maybe things will change and we don't wind up doing that, but that's their intent. So they think, in other words, at $7.99, they're going to get the greatest revenue they can from selling the number of units. They're going to hit this point on demand where if the price were higher, they'd get more revenue per sale, but the amount of sales would fall by a greater extent. And if they lower the price, they'll have more units sold, but they'll lose too much revenue on the sale of each one, right? That's what they're doing. That's why they hit an ask price like this. And so that explains the price, right? Explains the actual price that occurs in the actual price of the consumer good. Now, we don't have time to chase this down, but I'll just make one final remark about this. In my example, over the year of selling the iPhone 16 as a new consumer good, Apple's going to generate $15.98 billion in revenue, if my numbers are, correct. Okay, well, that gives them that much revenue that they can use to buy inputs, right? That's where they get the money to buy inputs. They only have two possibilities. They can get it from consumer purchases, or they can borrow the money from capitalists, right? And again, we don't have time here to go into those options. You'll take that up again tomorrow. But the complete explanation then, the bottom half of the diagram that we put up at the beginning, we show how producer goods prices are determined then by the entrepreneurs earning this revenue and then assessing the extent to which each input contributes to the revenue that's been generated, by us buying the good. All right, so we'll stop there. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and we'll go to lunch. Thank you. Thank you.